All right, welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We'll be continuing with part 3 of chapter 11, chapter 11 entitled Of the Rent of Land, and part 3 entitled Of the Variations in the Proportion between the respective values of that sort of produce which always affords rent, and of that which sometimes does and sometimes does not afford rent. Now, I have to warn everybody before I start part 3, which will end actually the first, I believe it's the first book here. This part and this video will begin a bit of a slog into the 400-year history of silver, beginning with what Smith describes as the first period, which will be the first century. We'll get about probably halfway through his writings on the first period today. But this does begin a bit of a slog in terms of history. The value that it might provide to everyone watching this and who wants to get into this would be how a non-fiat currency worked in his time and historically has worked, and what Adam Smith's thoughts are based on that period of 1350 to roughly 1750. So I apologize in advance if this turns out to be a total slog, especially because they're going to be using certainly, there's a lot of abbreviations and math and numerical values that I'm not accustomed to seeing because it is 2018 and not 1776. So again, I apologize in advance for all of that. I will put a link in this video when I do finally post it to the video in which we begin chapter 1 of book 2, and chapter 1 will be entitled Of the Division of Stock. And book 2 will be entitled Of the Nature, Accumulation, and Employment of Stock. So that if you don't want to sit through this honest slog of about 100 pages of history on this matter, you can go ahead and skip right to that. But without further ado, part 3 of chapter 11, Of the Variations in the Proportion between the respective values of that sort of produce which always affords rent, and of that which sometimes does and sometimes does not afford rent. The increasing abundance of food, in consequence of increasing improvement in cultivation, must necessarily increase the demand for every part of the produce of land which is not food, and which can be applied either to use or to ornament. In the whole progress of improvement, it might therefore be expected there should be only one variation in the comparative values of those two different sorts of produce. The value of that sort which sometimes does and sometimes does not afford rent should constantly rise in proportion to that which always affords some rent. As art and industry advance, the materials of clothing and lodging, the useful fossils and minerals of the earth, the precious metals and the precious stones should gradually come to be more and more in demand, should gradually exchange for a greater and greater quantity of food, or in other words, should gradually become dearer and dearer. This accordingly has been the case with most of these things upon most occasions, and would have been the case with all of them upon all occasions, if particular accidents had not upon some occasions increased the supply of some of them in a still greater proportion than the demand. The value of a freestone quarry, for example, will necessarily increase with the increasing improvement in population of the country round about it, especially if it should be the only one in the neighborhood. But the value of a silver mine, even though there should be not another within 1,000 miles of it, will not necessarily increase with the improvement of the country in which it is situated. The market for the produce of a freestone quarry can seldom extend more than a few miles round about it, and the demand must generally be in proportion to the improvement in population of that small district. But the market for the produce of a silver mine may extend over the whole known world. Unless the world in general, therefore, be advancing in improvement in population, the demand for silver might not be at all increased by the improvement even of a large country in the neighborhood of the mine. Even though the world in general were improving, yet if in the course of its improvement new mines should be discovered, much more fertile than any which had been known before, though the demand for silver would necessarily increase, yet the supply might increase in so much a greater proportion that the real price of that metal might gradually fall. That is, any given quantity, a pound weight of it, for example, might gradually purchase or command a smaller and a smaller quantity of labor, or exchange for a smaller and a smaller quantity of corn, the principal part of the substance of that laborer. The great market for silver is the commercial and civilized part of the world. If by the general progress of improvement the demand of this market should increase, while at the same time the supply did not increase in the same proportion, the value of silver would gradually rise in proportion to that of corn. Any given quantity of silver would exchange for a greater and a greater quantity of corn, or, in other words, the average money price of corn would gradually become cheaper and cheaper. If, on the contrary, the supply by some accident should increase for many years together in a greater proportion than the demand, the metal would gradually become cheaper and cheaper, or, in other words, the average money price of corn would, in spite of all improvements, gradually become dearer and dearer. But if, on the other hand, the supply of the metal should increase nearly in the same proportion as the demand, it would continue to produce or exchange for nearly the same quantity of corn, and the average money price of corn would, in spite of all improvements, continue very nearly the same. These three seem to exhaust all the possible combinations of events which can happen in the progress of improvement, and during the course of the 4 centuries preceding the present, if we may judge by what has happened both in France and Great Britain, each of those 3 different combinations seems to have taken place in the European market, and nearly in the same order in which I have here set them down. Digression concerning the variations and the value of silver during the course of the 4 last centuries. First period. In 1350, and for some time before, the average price of the quarter of wheat in England seems not to have been estimated lower than 4 ounces of silver, Tower weight, equal to about 20 shillings of our present money. From this price it seems to have fallen gradually to 2 ounces of silver, equal to about 10 shillings of our present money, the price at which we find it estimated in the beginning of the 16th century, and at which it seems to have continued to be estimated till about 1570. In 1350, beginning the 25th of Edward III, was enacted what is called the Statute of Laborers. In the preamble it complains much of this insolence of servants, who endeavor to raise their wages upon their masters. It therefore ordains that all servants and laborers should for the future be contented with the same wages and liveries in those times signified not only clothes but provisions, which they have been accustomed to receive in the 20th year of the king, and the 4 preceding years, that upon this account of their livery wheat should nowhere be estimated higher than 10 pence a bushel, and that it should always be in the option of the master to deliver them either the wheat or the money. 10 pence a bushel, therefore, had in the 25th of Edward III been reckoned a very moderate price of wheat, since it required a particular statute to oblige servants to accept of it in exchange for their usual livery of provisions, and it had been reckoned a reasonable price 10 years before that, or in the 16th year of the king, the term to which the statute refers. But in the 16th year of Edward III, 10 pence contained about half an ounce of silver, Tower weight, and was nearly equal to half a crown of our present money. 4 ounces of silver, Tower weight, therefore, equal to 6 shillings and 8 pence of the money of those times, and to near 20 shillings of that of the present, must have been reckoned a moderate price for the quarter of 8 bushels. The statute is surely a better evidence of what was reckoned in those times a moderate price of grain, than the prices of some particular years which have generally been recorded by historians and other writers on account of their extraordinary dearness or cheapness, and from which, therefore, it is difficult to form any judgment concerning what may have been the ordinary price. There are, besides, other reasons for believing that in the beginning of the 14th century, and for some time before, the common price of wheat was not less than 4 ounces of silver the quarter, and that of other grain in proportion. In 1309, Ralph de Born, prior of St. Augustine's, Canterbury, gave a feast upon his installation day, of which William Thorne has preserved not only the bill of fare, but the prices of many particulars. In that feast were consumed, first, 53 quarters of wheat, which cost £19, or 7 shillings and 2 pence a quarter, equal to about 1 shillings and 6 pence of our present money. 2 DLY, I don't know what that stands for, 58 quarters of malt, which costs 17 pounds 10 shillings or 6 shillings a quarter, equal to about 18 shillings of our present day money. 3 DLY, I don't know what that stands for, 20 quarters of oats, which cost 4 pounds or 4 shillings a quarter, equal to about 12 shillings of our present money. The prices of malt and oats seems here to be higher than their ordinary proportion to the price of wheat. These prices are not recorded on account of their extraordinary dearness or cheapness, but are mentioned accidentally as the prices actually paid for large quantities of grain consumed at a feast which was famous for its magnificence. In 1262, being the 51st of Henry III, was revived an ancient statute called the Assize of Bread and Ale, which the king says in the preamble had been made in the times of his progenitors, sometimes kings of England. It is probably, therefore, as old at least as the time of his grandfather Henry II, and may have been as old as the Conquest. It regulates the price of bread according as the prices of wheat may happen to be, from 1 shilling to 20 shillings the quarter of the money of those times. But statutes of this kind are generally presumed to provide with equal care for all deviations from the middle price, for those below it as well as those above it. 10 shillings, therefore, containing 6 ounces of silver, Tower weight, and equal to about 30 shillings of our present money, must, upon this supposition, have been reckoned the middle price of the quarter of wheat when this statute was first enacted, and must have continued to be so in the 51st of Henry III. We cannot therefore be very wrong in supposing that the middle price was not less than 1/3 of the highest price at which this statute regulates the price of bread, or than 6 shillings and 8 pence of the money of those times, containing 4 ounces of silver Tower weight. From these different facts, therefore, we seem to have some reason to conclude that about the middle of the 14th century, and for a considerable time before, the average or ordinary price of the quarter of wheat was not supposed to be less than 4 ounces of silver Tower weight. From about the middle of the 14th to the beginning of the 16th century, what was reckoned the reasonable and moderate, that is, the ordinary or average price of wheat, seems to have sunk gradually to about 1/2 of this price, so as at last to have fallen to about 2 ounces of silver Tower weight, equal to about 10 shillings of our present money. It continued to be estimated at this price till about 1570. In the Household Book of Henry, the 5th Earl of Northumberland, drawn up in 1512, there are 2 different estimations of wheat. In one of them it is computed at 6 shillings and 8 pence the quarter, in the other at 5 shillings and 8 pence only. In 1512, 6 shillings and 8 pence contained only 2 ounces of silver Tower weight, and were equal to about 10 shillings of our present money. From the 25th of Edward III to the beginning of the reign of Elizabeth, during the space of more than 200 years, 6 shillings and 8 pence, it appears from several different statutes, had continued to be considered as what is called the moderate and reasonable, that is, the ordinary or average price of wheat. The quantity of silver, however, contained in that nominal sum was, during the course of this period, continually diminishing in consequence of some alterations which were made in the coin. But the increase of the value of silver had, it seems, so far compensated the diminution of the quantity of it contained in the same nominal sum that the legislature did not think it worth while to attend to this circumstance. Thus, in 1436 it was enacted that wheat might be exported without a license when the price was so low as 6 shillings and 8 pence. And in 1463 it was enacted that no wheat should be imported if the price was not above 6 shillings and 8 pence the quarter. The legislature had imagined that when the price was so low, there could be no inconveniency in exportation, but that when it rose higher, it became prudent to allow of importation. 6 shillings and 8 pence, therefore, containing about the same quantity of silver as 13 shillings and 4 pence of our present money, 1/3 part less than the same nominal sum contained in the time of Edward III, had in those times been considered as what is called the moderate and reasonable price of wheat. In 1554, by the 1st and 2nd of Philip and Mary, and in 1558, by the 1st of Elizabeth, the exportation of wheat was in the same manner prohibited whenever the price of the quarter should exceed 6 shillings and 8 pence, which did not contain 2 penny worth more silver than the same nominal sum does at present. But it had soon been found that to restrain the exportation of wheat till the price was so very low was in reality to prohibit it altogether. In 1562, therefore, by the 5th of Elizabeth, the exportation of wheat was allowed from certain ports whenever the price of the quarter should not exceed 10 shillings, containing nearly the same quantity of silver as the nominal sum does at present. The price had at this time, therefore, been considered as what is called the moderate and reasonable price of wheat. It agrees nearly with the estimation of the Northumberland book in 1512. That in France the average price of grain was, in the same manner, much lower in the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century than in the 2 centuries preceding, has been observed both by Mr. Dupré de Samoir and by the elegant author of the essay on the police of grain. Its price during the same period had probably sunk in the same manner through the greater part of Europe. This rise in the value of silver in proportion to that of corn may either have been owing altogether to the increase of the demand for that metal, and consequence of increasing improvement in cultivation, the supply in the meantime continuing the same as before, or the demand continuing the same as before. It may have been owing altogether to the gradual diminution of the supply, the greater part of the mines which were then known in the world being much exhausted, and consequently the expense of working them much increased. Or it may have been owing partly to one and partly to the other of those 2 circumstances. In the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th centuries, the greater part of Europe was approaching towards a more settled form of government than it had enjoyed for several ages before. The increase of security would naturally increase industry and improvement, and the demand for precious metals, as well as for every other luxury and ornament, would naturally increase with the increase of riches. A greater annual produce would require a greater quantity of coin to circulate it, and a greater number of rich people would require a greater quantity of plate and other ornaments of silver. It is natural to suppose, too, that the greater part of the mines which then supplied the European market with silver might be a good deal exhausted and have become more expensive in the working. They had been wrought, many of them, from the time of the Romans. It has been the opinion, however, of the greater part of those who have written upon the prices of commodities in ancient times that, from the conquest, perhaps from the invasion of Julius Caesar till the discovery of the mines of America, the value of silver was continually diminishing. This opinion they seem to have been led into, partly by the observations which they had occasion to make upon the prices both of corn and of some other parts of the rude produce of land, and partly by the popular notion that, as the quantity of silver naturally increases in every country with the increase of wealth, so its value diminishes as its quantity increases. In their observations upon the prices of corn, 3 different circumstances seem frequently to have misled them. First, in ancient times almost all rents were paid in kind, and a certain quantity of corn, cattle, poultry, etc. It sometimes happened, however, that the landlord would stipulate that he should be at liberty to demand of the tenant either the annual payment in kind or a certain sum of money instead of it. The price at which the payment in kind was, in this manner, exchanged for a certain sum of money is in Scotland called the conversion price. As the option is always in the landlord to take either the substance or the price, it is necessary for the safety of the tenant that the conversion price should rather be below than above the average market price. In many places, accordingly, it is not much above 1/2 of this price. Though the greater part of Scotland, this custom still continues with regard to poultry and in some places with regard to cattle. It might probably have continued to take place, too, with regard to corn, had the institution of the public friars put an end to it. These are annual valuations, according to the judgment of an assize, of the average price of all the different sorts of grain and of all the different qualities of each according to the actual market price in every different country. The institution rendered it sufficiently safe for the tenant and much more convenient for the landlord to convert, as they call it, the corn rent, rather at what should happen to be the price of the friars of each year, than at any certain fixed price. But the writers who have collected the prices of corn in ancient times seem frequently to have mistaken what is called in Scotland the conversion price for the actual market price. Fleetwood acknowledges upon one occasion that he had made this mistake. As he wrote his book, however, for a particular purpose, he does not think proper to make this acknowledgment till after transcribing this conversion price 15 times. The price is 8 shillings the quarter of wheat. The sum in 1423, the year at which he begins with it, contained the same quantity of silver as 16 shillings of our present money. But in 1562, the year at which he ends with it, it contained no more than the same nominal sum does at present. Secondly, they have been misled by the slovenly manner in which some ancient statutes of the assize have been sometimes transcribed by lazy copiers, and sometimes perhaps actually composed by legislature. The ancient statutes of assize seem to have begun always with determining what ought to be the price of bread and ale when the price of wheat and barley were at the lowest, and to have proceeded gradually to determine what it ought to be according as the prices of those two sorts of grain should gradually rise above this lowest price. But the transcribers of those statutes seem frequently to have thought it sufficient to copy the regulation as far as the 3 or 4 first and lowest prices, saving in this manner their own labor and judging, I suppose, that this was enough to show that what proportion ought to be observed in all higher prices. Thus in the assize of bread and ale of the 51st of Henry III, the price of bread was regulated according to the different prices of wheat, from 1 shilling to 20 shillings the quarter of the money of those times. But in the manuscripts from which all the different editions of the statutes preceding that of Mr. Rufford were printed, the copiers had never transcribed this regulation beyond the price of 12 shillings. Several writers, therefore, being led by this faulty transcription, very naturally concluded that the middle price, or 6 shillings the quarter, equal to about 18 shillings of our present money, was the ordinary or average price of wheat at that time. In the statute of Tumbrel and Pillory, enacted nearly about the same time, the price of ale is regulated according to every 6 pence rise in the price of barley, from 2 shillings to 4 shillings the quarter. That 4 shillings, however, was not considered as the highest price to which the barley might frequently rise in those times, and that these prices were only given as an example of the proportion which ought to be observed in all other prices, whether higher or lower, we may infer from the last words of the statute. Oh God, I can't read this Latin. Et sic dienceps crescitur vel diminutur per sex denarios. The expression is very slovenly, but the meaning is plain enough. That the price of ale in this manner to be increased or diminished according to every 6 pence rise or fall in the price of barley. In the composition of this statute, the legislature itself seems to have been as negligent as the copiers were in the transcription of the other. In the ancient manuscript of the Regium Magistratum, an old Scotch law book, there is a statute of assize in which the price of bread is regulated according to all the different prices of wheat, from 10 pence to 3 shillings the Scotch bowl, equal to about half an English quarter. 3 shillings Scotch at the time when the assize is supposed to have been enacted were equal to about 9 shillings sterling of our present money. Mr. Ruddiman seems to conclude from this that 3 shillings was the highest price to which wheat ever rose in those times, and that 10 pence a shilling, or at most 2 shillings, were the ordinary prices. Upon consulting the manuscript, however, it appears evidently that all these prices are only set down as examples of the proportion which ought to be observed between the respective prices of wheat and bread. The last words of the statute are, again, more Latin I can't read. The last words of the statute are reliqua judicabus secundum prescripta habendo respectum ad precium bladi. You shall judge of the remaining cases according to what is above written, having a respect to the price of corn. Thirdly, they seem to have been misled too by the very low price at which wheat was sometimes sold in very ancient times, and to have imagined that as its lowest price was then much lower than in later times, its ordinary price must likewise have been much lower. They might have found, however, that in those ancient times its highest price was fully as much above as its lowest price was below anything that had ever been known in the later times. Thus, in 1270, Fleetwood gives us two prices of the quarter of wheat. One is 4 pounds 16 shillings of the money of those times, equal to 14 pounds 8 shillings of that of the present. The other is 6 pounds 8 shillings, equal to 19 pounds 4 shillings of our present money. No price can be found in the end of the 15th or beginning of the 16th century which approaches to the extravagance of these. The price of corn, though at all times liable to variation, varies most in the turbulent and most disorderly societies in which the interruption of all commerce and communication hinders the plenty of one part of the country from relieving the scarcity of another. In the disorderly state of England under the Plantagenets, who governed it from about the middle of the 12th towards the end of the 15th century, one district might be in plenty, while another at no great distance, by having its crop destroyed either by some accident of the seasons or by the incursion of some neighboring baron, might be suffering all the horrors of a famine, and yet if the lands of some hostile lord were interposed between them, the one might not be able to give the least assistance to the other. Under the vigorous administration of the Tudors, who governed England during the latter part of the 15th and through the whole of the 16th century, no baron was powerful enough to dare disturb the public security. Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and call it quits there. We'll continue tomorrow with part 3 of chapter 11 of The Rent of Land. So until then, chapter 11 is actually titled we'll be continuing tomorrow on chapter 11 either way. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.